Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Bible class for today. We're going to be going through Ruth chapter 2. Excited to be continuing our walk through this book of Ruth, which is a breath of fresh air after the book of the Judges, where we saw everything going wrong and people doing their own thing. Now, here in Ruth, we begin to see maybe what it looks like to be faithful in the midst of a faithless world. And so we'll continue walking through the book of Ruth. Let's go ahead and begin now with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for this time that we get to gather together to share in your word, to learn, to grow, to be stretched by you. So just continue to lead us and guide us during this time. Thanks for this opportunity to connect in this way. Through this technology. And Lord, just continue to remind us that we are never alone because you are there beside us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. Well, again, good to see everybody today. Today we move forward and we get a lot of the action in Ruth. It continues to build and develop. We meet the rest of the players and the actors in this book and really begins to set up possibilities for solutions in this. So just want to have you think for a minute, just as by way of, and if you want to put something in the chat box or something like that, you can, but just to think for yourselves at least, if you're married, how you met your spouse. When did you first meet your spouse? What did that meeting look like? Was it love at first sight? Did you know right away? Or what did that look like? I'll just share for Nikki and I, when we first met, it was at my brother's wedding rehearsal. My brother married Nikki's cousin. And so her mom was the organist, the musician for the ceremony. We'd never met before because our families aren't related. And so we were all there at the rehearsal dinner, and Nikki caught my eye, and she was sitting down already. And so I went over and introduced myself, and we started talking. And so that's how Nikki and I first met. We started dating about a year or so later. But Nikki and I first met there at the wedding rehearsal. It was kind of interesting. The next day, though, in the receiving line for the wedding, Nikki comes through with her sister and her grandma. And her grandma is I'd met her before, but her grandma says, well, Andy, I just wanted to make sure you had met my other granddaughter, Nikki. And so her grandma thinks that she introduced us, and she kind of didn't even introduce Nikki's sister, Becky, at all. It was just Nikki at that point. So it's kind of an interesting, fun little story. So we don't tell Rosemary, Gigi any different. She thinks she introduced us, and that's okay. So that's how we met. Ruth and Boaz have their story, and we're going to be talking about that today. And for those of you that are married or have been married that way, you've probably got your stories there of when you met first met your significant other that way. So let's go ahead and jump in. Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. If somebody be willing to read that, that would be great. Let's go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in and go ahead and read. I see Deb moving to unmute herself there, I think. Yes?
Yeah. Okay, I can read. All right. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elamite, a man standing whose name was Boaz. And Ruth and the Moabites said to Naomi, let me go to the fields. Did I say that right? No. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out and began to glean the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was the clan Meliach. Just as Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters, the Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, whose young woman is that? The foreman replied, she is the Moabitess, who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. So she went, I can't read, maybe I shouldn't. She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter.
Thank you so much. That's great. Yep. So we got, if you remember, Elimelech was the Naomi's husband, the one who was who had died over in Moab. And so we meet this guy named Boaz, who is a relative of Elimelech. So they're of the same clan, which was Ephrath, right? You Bethlehem Ephrathah, right? That was the clan they were from. We learned that last time. So so how is Boaz described here? If we look at this, Boaz, as it says there, a relative of Naomi's husband. So he's of the same clan. He's a close relative, and he's a worthy man. And so the Hebrew, that literally means that he is a mighty man of valor. And so, but he's worthy. He's got valor. He's chivalrous, maybe in the midst of all of that. He's upright. He's faithful. But there could be even, he's a defender in the midst of that, a man of integrity. Yeah, thanks, Mom, in the midst of those things. Yeah, the same clan, he's an Ephrathite. And we also learn about Boaz that he is wealthy. He has land. He has servants. He's not just working the land himself, but he has servants that are actually doing the work for him, which says that he has wealth. So the famine he must have survived the famine through everything and maybe did well during the famine, even as he managed his things, because he has land and servants to tend the land for him, where he doesn't even have to be out doing most of the work or labor himself. He comes out sometime during the day. He's not in there in the morning, or maybe even the heat of the day he's there. He comes in later. So Ruth so we get this interesting situation where Ruth says to Naomi, hey, let me go and I'll go and take some other people's grain and bring it back for us, right? If you really think about it, that's what she's telling Naomi. I'm going to go pick other people's grain and bring it home for us to eat. All right. Now that, if you really think about that, that's kind of odd on the surface for us. You shouldn't go into somebody else's garden and pick their vegetables or their strawberries. People would look and frown poorly on that. Or if I went into a farmer's field and began plucking ears of corn out of that, we have a word for that. It's called stealing, right? Taking what's not yours. So Ruth is saying, hey, let me go and do this. The only difference is there's actually a law that God has set up that allows for this. So let's go ahead and go to Leviticus chapter 19, and we'll see and understand what's actually going on here. Leviticus chapter 19, going and starting at verse 9. So if you remember, the book of Leviticus follows Exodus. The first half of Exodus, first 2/3 of Exodus, really recount the freeing of God's people out of Egypt, Moses' leadership there to Mount Sinai, and then the receiving of the 10 Commandments. There at the Mount Sinai, God also gives instructions for how to build the tabernacle, the place where they were to worship, this portable tent, portable temple, basically. And then also a lot of other of the laws are given at Mount Sinai about worship and sacrifices. Well, then you continue into the book of Leviticus, and those laws are expanded on worship, on how to treat each other, on prohibitions and stipulations and all these kinds of things of how they're to live. So this is Leviticus. The middle of the book talks about the Day of Atonement and how God reconciles his people to himself. And then right after this, you have kind of this idea in Leviticus 19 is where this verse comes into play. And so Leviticus 19, 9 and 10 says this: When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right to its edge, neither shall you gather gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord. And it goes on to talk about, you shall not steal, shall not deal falsely, how all these other, you shall not oppress your neighbor, you shall not do injustice in court, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. And then verse 18, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Right? This idea of love your neighbor as yourself, part of that, the first part of that, is that you are to not, when you take your harvest, you're not to go out to the very edge to make sure that you get every last piece of grain. You're to harvest, but you're to make sure you'll leave at least a little extra on the margins for those people that are on the margins, for the widows and the foreigners who don't have a way of providing for themselves because they don't have an inheritance or a land that they can call their own. And you're not to go back again and like, oh, I missed some things, I'm going to go back over that a second time to make sure I get every last thing. But whatever is there, you're to let the sojourner, the widow, pick up. Yeah, Jim, thanks for that. It's also repeated in Deuteronomy. It's also repeated again in Leviticus chapter 23. 23 verse 22. It basically says the same thing. It says, and when you reap your harvest of your field, you shall not reap right to the edge, nor shall you gather gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the sojourner. I am the Lord. So this repetition of this command to make sure that those on the margins are taken care of. What's interesting in chapter 23 is this command that's reiterated takes place right after the command about the Festival of Weeks, which is the festival that took place after the wheat harvest. And so it was a reminder, again, every time when you're remembering to celebrate this, that you're also remembering those that do not have as much or are unable to provide for themselves, that you are able in leaving that behind for them, so that they can be provided for as well. So if you think about there to leave some for the poor and sojourner, Ruth is both of these things. She's a sojourner. She's from Moab, but she's also poor. She and Naomi don't have anything. Whatever they have is what they carried with them from Moab. And so Ruth is both these things in the midst of that. And what are we harvesting right now? To kind of pick up on that, and maybe had to go back. When we got to the end of chapter 1, it's where it tells us that it was at the beginning of the barley harvest. And so that's what they're harvesting right now is barley. And I want to share my screen with you for a second and just kind of talk about the agriculture stuff in Israel. Some of you may have seen this before, but just kind of want to go through this chart with you. So on around the edges, you see these big letters here. These stand for months of the year. So this is January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December, right? And so the calendar goes around counterclockwise. And then you see this crescent moon shape here. That's the chances of rain and the amount of rains they could get in those times. And really, you're probably not seeing rains until September, October, and they're really done by March, April. So that's what's happened. So their growing cycle, their planting and harvesting cycle really begins for grains in September, October. They have the Feast of Booths, of Tabernacles, where they would all gather together and camp for a week, but to do that kind of in the temple courts once the temple was built. And And that's really, they did that right before the early rains, or the former rains, sometimes they're called, would start. And that would loosen the ground and moisten the ground enough to be able to plant. And that's when the grains would be planted in this time period. And then they would grow over the winter. And then in March is when the barley would be harvested. And you needed at least 8 inches of rain to grow barley. And so when Ruth starts and there's this famine that's going on, it means they probably, whether it was invaders from the Midianites or others, or they weren't getting 8 inches in that year, or both, that's why they would have a famine. And then the harvest would take place all the way through April, May, until the wheat harvest. And wheat, you needed at least 12 inches of rain there. And this would be when the Passover or the Pentecost would happen, would be right around this wheat harvest that's there. And that's really that Festival of Weeks is that time here that goes on. So that's the growing season. And then you have, through this period, you're not getting any rains. You are getting some dew and other things, enough to sustain the grapes, the figs, the pomegranates, the green olives, the black olives, so on and so forth, until you plow and plant again. But these would be harvested in the fall. And so in spring, when the kings went off to war, it's this period that they're in, going to war, when there's not really a lot for the farmers to do. And so that's the growing cycle there. And just I want to show, oh, there's a wrong way. Here's a slice. If you cut Israel and down the line, and you can see into the mountains, you can see the rains that they come off the Mediterranean Sea. As the elevation increases, they get more rain. And then Jerusalem is here as you go down into the Rift Valley, you see the rains really decrease. And Bethlehem is probably around this area where the Herodian is. That's about where Bethlehem is as far as elevation goes. So getting close to that 8-inch line where you can't even grow barley anymore. All right. So that is that's hopefully a little bit about Israel agriculture and life and growth, and hopefully helps you understand Ruth a little bit more of the timings of when they were growing and what was going on. This was the time of the barley harvest. So it had been starting about last month, going until, or 2-3 weeks ago, and then moving now into the getting closer to the wheat harvest. And that's really the context, the timing of the account of the action that we see in Ruth after they return to Bethlehem. So it's in spring, right about this time is really when during the year the book of Ruth took place. Okay. Boaz comes from, we read, he comes from Bethlehem. And the fields were not necessarily right next to their homes. They might have lived within the city, inside maybe city gates or walls, and had a little space there. And then they would go out, and the fields would not necessarily have homesteads and things on them. But the fields would be there, maybe marked by stones. We saw some of that, I saw some of that in Israel the first time I was there, where the different fields would be marked off by stones for one person's field to the next, but not necessarily with a house or a homestead or something like that on it, like we think about in if you drive out in Kansas or in Illinois or things like that, and you see the farm, and then you have the farmhouse, and then you have another farm and another farmhouse. Now the fields are kind of lined up next to each other, but people were living, at least it seems here, and kind of still the case in some places in Israel today, would be living in the villages or the towns together for safety or for other things. And so Boaz comes to the field. He's checking on his workers. He's checking on the harvest. And he's working to make sure that everything's okay. So what I love here is when Boaz arrives, he greets his workers. And there's almost a kind of a liturgy like we would do in church back and forth with each other. And it's seeped into daily life, which is, I think, pretty cool. It says, "The Lord be with you." If I say the Lord be with you, your kind of first instinct would say, and also with you, right? That's kind of what we speak back and forth. Well, this in daily life, Boaz to his workers, those that are under his care, he says, the Lord be with you. He's giving them that blessing of peace. And instead of saying, and also with you, they responded, the Lord bless you. What a kind of a great back and forth of a daily greeting, that they used even in secular life. This wasn't reserved just for worship. This greeting and blessing back and forth that included the Lord's blessing was part of the daily rhythm of life. And maybe that became rote or mundane or trivial, but it still was the words they used back and forth to bless one another and greet one another, even in regular life. And so just kind of think about that, of how we could bring our faith into our greetings and blessings with each other in a real way, not in a trivial way. I've heard some folks say, how you doing? Well, and they might say something trite or trivial, and it's kind of doesn't come off as genuine or authentic, trying to bring the Lord into it. But maybe there's a way to do that and have that become meaningful in that. So then Boaz asks, whose woman is this? He's asking really, whose authority is she under? Because he recognizes her as a poor or a sojourner, a foreigner, and that just as his servants are under his authority, this person would have to be under somebody else's authority. He's not really saying, hey, who is she? Like trying to check her out or something like that. He's trying to really find out just, whose authority is she under, to make sure that he's honoring and respecting the authority that is there and the connections that she has. And the servants report that she belongs to Elimelech's family, and that she's caring for Ruth, or Ruth is caring for Naomi, and that she has been diligent and hardworking, that she has a good character and is hardworking, diligent in that. So, okay, just going through that first section, what questions, comments, thoughts, clarifications that we have? If you're on a phone and you want to make a comment, just press *6 on your phone, and that will unmute your phone, and you can have a comment or share that way too. If you got something you want to put in the chat box, or put a exclamation point or question mark, or just unmute yourself if you're on video to do that as well, that's good too. So.
Pastor?
Yes, Michelle.
When you were talking about the greeting, I think we find it easier, at least I do. I find it easier to do that in email. Like when you're closing up your email, it's kind of easier to just give a little blessing, more than in talking, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great point, Michelle. I think that's a great way to maybe add that in, or to do that is via email, of just how do we bless one another in that? How do, and that's a great way to do that too, is via email. I think sometimes when we try to do that in our speech, it comes off as not genuine, or almost sometimes fake or over the top or something like that. But how cool in this culture, at least, that even in speech wasn't odd, where I think we'd say that in our emails, in our written communication, we don't find that nearly as a struggle. I think many of us that way. One of the things that I've been doing during this time is when I text with people, there's some folks that I'm texting with, especially some of our younger adults that I'm texting with. I'll just start that conversation maybe every week, every other week, of just, hey, thinking about you, praying for you. Is there anything specific I can pray for you today? And just bringing that idea or conversation of God into the conversation of prayer, in just a real and genuine way, not in maybe a contrived or a forced way. So I'd maybe give you that challenge of, you can even do it while we're meeting today, is if you're not on your phone, at least, is get your phone out and find somebody that maybe you haven't talked to in a while, or you think could use God's blessing, and just to let them know, just say a quick little prayer and say, I'm praying for you, and do you have any specific prayer requests? You could get your phone out and do that right now. It's a great way to bring God and faith and a blessing into their life, just through through your phone that way. So God bless you. Praying for you today. Do you have any specific prayer requests? And who knows where that conversation will lead. Pastor Kirk asked just how do we care for widows today? And we can explore that now. We're going to talk about that maybe a little later, but if we do it now, we don't need to do it later either. In the midst of that, as we think about caring for the poor and for the sojourners, those that are in need today on the margins. As I think about that, as I look at that, I think one of the struggles in our country that we have is we, as the church, deferred to the government to do that for us. When before we had things like welfare and Social Security, and those aren't necessarily bad things, so don't hear me saying that, but before we had those things, if there was a struggle or a problem and somebody was in need in your community, the community spearheaded and took that upon themselves to make sure that person was cared for. And oftentimes that happened through the ministry of the local congregations because they knew the people, they knew what they needed, they knew actually what was going to be helpful, and not some one for all specific program for, it's going to fit, 1 million, 10 million people or whatever it's going to be. When that happened, I think churches kind of deferred that to the government. And I think we've been trying to reclaim that now of seeing, hey, there's still need among us and need for us to be active and working as the church. And so I know we're involved with things like food pantries. And this weekend, you're going to hear a message from Pastor Schultz that talks about that, that talks about in the announcements that the Arnold Food Pantry needs food. And there's specific ways that you can, on the website, there'll be specific ways that they'll tell you how you can do that and where you can drop that off at the food pantry directly to bless poor and those that are in need that way. I know some of you that are watching have a heart for widows and, make a point to write cards and letters and connect with them that way to make sure that there's a connection and a friendship and a kinship there. So those are a couple of things off the top of my head, other ministries and programs that are there. We can explore that a little more. Jim, did you have anything to add on that?
Maybe later on, towards the end of the study, we can talk a little bit about many of us are being inundated with financial requests from all sorts of areas, including the Synod, the seminary, every charity we've ever given to. Yeah. We have many of us here today have probably received some kind of stimulus check. And the question is, where is that best suited for us to think about some of those things if we're able to do that, where to give? And I'm moved by what I see happening in North County. And I think, again, we have allowed the government to take over a number of these things, but are there specific suggestions about where the help could be the most? One of my neighbors went to Arnold Pantry yesterday and volunteered and served there. And I said, are they in great need? He says, no, they have food, and that's good. I don't know how long that will last, but I think it's time for us to think about where can we be of assistance. And Ruth is a good example of being able to go out there and glean, but what is it for us? And I don't want to take away from the Bible study, but I think we ought to at least think about it somewhere along the way.
So one of the things that Pastor Schultz and I were on a conference call with, or a video conference with about 75 Missouri district pastors that President Hagan, our district president, was leading, and Joel Christensen, who's pastor at Webster Gardens. They've empowered their small groups to be their hands and feet of how they distribute their care into the community. So instead of saying, hey, the church is going to give to this and this and this and this, they've kind of switched the paradigm and saying, well, Jim, we're going to give your small group some money, and you guys are going to use that to bless people in your community, in your neighborhood that that need something. I'm like, that was an interesting way to maybe shift that paradigm of, our people, we know people around us that are in need, that have lost jobs, that are there. And instead of relying on the church to take the lead on that, is no, let's move and mobilize and be the church in our individual groups that way. So I thought that was an interesting concept. I'm still kind of chewing on that and noodling that a little bit.
Yeah,
But yeah, Jim, we can talk about that a little bit later on as well. So yeah, thanks. Any other questions, comments about this first section in Ruth here?
I have one. Getting back to Ruth and gleaning the field, I always got the impression that it is exactly what you said you didn't think it was, that Boaz was probably, like you said with Nikki, she caught his eye, that he was probably moved by either her appearance or something about her. And the reason I always thought that is because no mention of anybody else's. He doesn't say, who are all those people? And I assume there were probably several gleaning on the edges. So you kind of blew my mind there a little bit when you said that, because I always thought it was that he was attracted to her for some reason.
Yeah, I think it could be that, but as I read this, I'm looking at this. This is a small town. Boaz knows, and he's prominent in this small town, and he knows most of the folks that are there, and so he knows the people that are on the margins, and so Naomi and Ruth have just arrived, right? Because they arrive at the beginning of the barley harvest, and so here's someone he's never seen before, and he wants to be in the know, to know what's going on and to have this there. So there could be some, she's attractive also, but I think most of it is he really just wants to know who this is and who she's connected with, and who is it that's in need in this community in the midst of those things. So I think that's probably more the driver of that. As I read some different commentaries and different things, most of them actually suggest that Boaz is older, 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and maybe and married with his own family and his own children. And so many of the commentaries that I read, most of the commentaries suggest that, and actually when we get to the next chapter, it puts this, the negotiations that begin to happen between Boaz and this other relative make more sense if Boaz is married as well as this other man, that they're both married in the midst of this. But Boaz, in some ways, for us, that maybe is less romantic because we like this, this, prince and princess, and they live happily ever after. And there's, but if he's married, it actually heightens the sacrifice that he makes to take care of Ruth and do an honorable and noble thing here by caring for Ruth and marrying her. In this culture, right? Doesn't necessarily apply to our culture as we think about that, but in this culture, that's actually heightens the sacrifice that he makes by being willing to marry Ruth and be the not only the kinsman redeemer, but to be the Levirate marriage to have a son for his dead relative. So we'll get to that. We'll talk about that more in the coming weeks. But the commentaries I read, most of them suggested, if not all of them, that Boaz is probably married. So yeah, Mom,
Totally took the Hallmark moment out of that for me.
Sorry, that's not how we would make the Hallmark movie of Ruth and today. We would leave that part out probably. Yeah. Ed and Judy, I think you're right on that. That he also would have noticed how hard she was working, and that would have probably drawn his attention to her as well. In the midst of that, and that only is heightened by the report that that his head servant, his steward, if you will, his manager of the servants, gives to him about Ruth, that she's working hard, and that she hasn't taken a break except for one short rest just to kind of refresh herself there. So, all right. Any other thoughts, questions, comments before we move on to the next section? Can somebody then read for us Ruth chapter 2, verses 8 through 13?
I will.
Thanks, Laura.
Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men to not touch you? And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants."
Thank you very much. All right, so Boaz treats Ruth with honor and respect. He treats her and gives her protection. He tells her not to go and glean in a different field, but only to glean where his servants are gleaning. And so men and women are both out in the harvest gleaning, and he says, "Stay next to my young servants, those that are under Boaz's protection. And if something would, some harm would come to them, then Boaz would go after the person who did it." Right? That's what the idea of protection there. And Boaz has told his young men that are servants there not to harm her, but to look after her and provide and care for her as well. And so Boaz is basically making and taking Ruth under his protection and care. This woman who has no one to protect or provide for her because she has no husband and no father here. Boaz is taking her under his protection, much like one of his servants, and caring for her in that way. And so that's what Boaz is doing there for Ruth. And he tells her just again, "Stay close to my servants. Wherever they're gleaning, then glean there." Again, when they finished that field, they would have gone to another one of Boaz's fields. It may have been adjacent to this. It may have been a distance off, but to stay next to his servants and glean in his fields is what Boaz is telling her that way. And then Boaz gives her a great blessing. Just the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, may he repay you for what you have done. Give a full reward. I love that. Under whose wings you have taken refuge. This idea of a hen gathering the chicks under the wings there, taking a refuge there. That God gathers his flock under his wings to cover, protect them from the elements. This idea again that Naomi was leaving her gods behind and becoming and worshiping the God of Israel and trusting in the God of Israel. Boaz highlights that Naomi has done this, that she's left her gods behind and now is worshiping and trusting in and residing in the land of Israel, but also trusting in the God of Israel at the same time. So that's really what we see going on here in Ruth with Boaz and Boaz and Naomi and this blessing that Boaz gives to her there. What a great blessing, under whose wings you take refuge. That God provides, protects, and cares for her in all things. That Ruth is now not just trusting and being with Naomi, but trusting in Naomi's God. As she said, "Your people, my people, your God will be my God," right? In the midst of that. And then I always find this interesting how God uses us to answer prayers. When I heard somebody say that if you're praying for someone else, that God would provide for them or protect them or help them or lift them up or whatever it might be, give them comfort, be ready for God to use you to be the answer to that prayer. Doesn't mean that he always does it that way, but often God uses us to be the answer to that prayer for other people. You know, if we're praying, man, God, be with this person and strengthen them and help them during this time. Well, maybe that's God putting on your heart to be the answer, part of the answer to that prayer, to give them a call and to let them know that they're not alone and that God loves them and they're with them and that you're thinking about them and praying for them, right? You're part of the answer to that prayer. Maybe not the whole answer, but part of that answer. And here we see God using Boaz to fulfill his blessing. Boaz says, the Lord repay you for what you have done and a full reward given you by the Lord. And what is Boaz already doing? He's rewarding Ruth. He's providing protection and provision for Ruth in the midst of this time. And so God is using Boaz to be the answer to Boaz's blessing. And I find that often I see that God working that way, at least in my own life and my own prayers. Whereas I'm praying for somebody, God's then putting it on my heart to be the action and answer to that prayer. So any thoughts or comments on this section or about that being the answer to our prayers, that God's providing us as the answer that way? Mom, any thoughts, questions, comments?
In our first congregation, there was on the wall this humongous sculpture of Jesus. I think he was on the
Shepherd.
Oh, he was acting like a shepherd. But at any rate, he had no hands and no feet. And the pastor would explain periodically that the reason the artist designed it like that was to remind us that we are the hands and feet of Jesus. Just what you're saying, that God wanted to use us to be the hands and feet to the world. And every Sunday you would sit in church and look at that sculpture and think about that message, and it really sunk in with me. It left a mark.
Yeah, and what a privilege that God uses us in that way, to have us be part of his mission, of his blessing of other people, to include us in that, to entrust us and empower us with those things as well. Yeah, any other thoughts or questions, comments? Again, as we look at this, Boaz, I kind of skipped over one of the questions there of why does Boaz say he's treating Ruth this way? You know, and how does Ruth respond? So let's go back and jump and get those. I kind of jumped over 10 and 11 there. Sorry about that. If you're following along on the study guide, of Ruth's response to Boaz is that she falls on her face, bowing to the ground, and wondering why he has taken notice of her, of why that he's treating her in this way, with kindness and generosity and protection, and Ruth is humbled and she has that posture, and Boaz says it's because of your dead husband and because of how you're treating your mother-in-law. So it's how you're respecting the dead, but also how you're respecting the living and working. And so, again, there's not a hint here of romantic interest on either side that we see at this point. Sorry about that, Mom, of breaking that Hallmark movie moment. It really is, Ruth is doing the honorable and right thing. And Boaz sees it and he responds with another honorable and right thing. As they're, kind of, this is the way it should be, not an ulterior motive by Ruth or Boaz of a romantic or a sexual interest. It's more they're just doing the right thing because it's the right thing. And in their words, at least, if we take them at face value, which I think we should and can, that's what we see. It's they're doing the honorable thing. Again, Boaz is a worthy man, an honorable man, a man of valor and integrity, and that he's doing exactly that as we would expect him to after that introduction in the first verse of this chapter. He's doing above and beyond what he's required to do. He's doing what's good and right and full of valor and praiseworthy. Yeah. Any other thoughts and questions there? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and jump down then. If somebody can read verses 14 through 16.
I will.
Thank you.
And at mealtime, said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her."
All right. So here we see Boaz's generosity and his kindness continuing to overflow. This is not just he's doing the bare minimum to ease his conscience. His generosity is overflowing, even to the point where he's taking some of what his workers have done and giving it to Ruth. He elevates Ruth from a foreigner and an outsider to sit amongst his household, his servants, and to receive food even from his own hand. And she doesn't just receive a little bit, she has an abundance. She has some left over. Even after a full day is working and probably not eating very well before this because they don't really have anything, she eats until she's satisfied and still has some left over. And then just that kindness again, he's going above and beyond what he's required to do. He doesn't just give her a morsel of bread. He gives her until she has no want. He doesn't just allow her to glean among the edges. He's allowing her to glean among the sheaves, and even is having his workers pull out some of the grain that's already been harvested and leaving it in bundles for her to pick up. He's going above and beyond what he's required to do. Just the generosity that he shows her, because of the generosity and the kindness that she has shown to Naomi. Again, Boaz's blessing is being fulfilled through his own actions. He asked God to bless her and repay her and to give her a full reward by the Lord. And then through his own actions, he's doing this. And God is giving her that full reward through even his own actions. But again, Boaz sees that as coming from the Lord, not from him in the way he blesses her. All right. Any thoughts or questions on this section? It's a little shorter here, but any thoughts or questions on this section? Okay. Not seeing any. We'll kind of go on to this last section here. Can somebody read 17 through 23 of Ruth chapter 2?
I guess I can.
Thanks, Deb.
Okay, so Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley and she gathered it, amounted to about an ephah. She carried it carried it to town to her mother-in-law. How much she had let me start over here. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of your soul, took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked today is Boaz," she said. "Then the Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "The man is close relative. He is one of our kinsmen redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, He even said to me, "Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all the grain." Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
All right. Thank you. All right. So we get to kind of the end of the account here of this chapter. So with the grain, she took the grain, and then she, after a day of harvesting and a day of working through all of that, she then threshed it out, which means that she beat the grain. She separated the wheat and the chaff, and just had the grain left over on the threshing floor. And she would have done that at evening time. And so Ruth's been gone all day, and she comes back with an ephah. And that term made no sense to me, so I looked it up, and it was kind of going that it's a 3/5 of the bushel, which that didn't help me either. And then, which also is about 22 liters. And maybe you're like me and kind of, I know what a 2-liter bottle looks like, but so almost 6 gallons, which I finally, okay, I understand that. Okay. Another place, so that's a little bit less than a cubic foot, or about 29 pounds. Yep, thanks, Laura. About 29 pounds of grain. And so for one person, for one day, that's an amazing amount of grain. It is basically what that means. And if you know what an ephah is or a bushel, then you're like, oh, okay, this is, there. And so she then continues to harvest day after day with Boaz's servants in the midst of that. So she and Naomi, we learn here, specifically live within the town of Bethlehem that's there. They live in the city. Now, whether this was a structure that they had before they went or not, we don't know that. But yeah, it'd have been a heavy load to carry home. Probably she'd have wrapped that in a shawl or something else like that to tie that up to carry home. They were ingenious in how they carried things and transported things using what they had to do that. So, but it had been carried back to Bethlehem. We don't know how far outside the field, the city this was, but carried that grain back to Bethlehem. She and Naomi lived inside Bethlehem, this town, this village that's there. Again, we don't know what that home or that house would have looked like, whether that would have been a Elimelech's that they kind of had to repair or was in disrepair, or what that would have been. So besides the barley, though, besides the 29 pounds of barley, what else did Ruth bring to Naomi? If you notice there, she brought the leftovers back to Naomi. Whatever she had eaten from the meal that Boaz provided for her, she brought back the leftovers to Naomi to eat as well. Again, this shows, I think, about her character, her selflessness, that she isn't worried about the scarcity mindset of just kind of hoarding and taking for herself to make sure that she has what she needed. She didn't just leave the leftovers there with Boaz. She was even at that point thinking about caring for her mother-in-law, for Naomi, to share and provide for her. That's her motivation. That's why she's doing what she's doing. She's not just not just saying, where you go, I will go. She's following that up with her actions and her attitudes and her provision for Naomi throughout all of this, first in the harvest, but also then in just this simple meal. Shows her character, that she really does care for and provide for Naomi throughout all of this. So Naomi knows that Ruth has been blessed because of the amount of food that she has brought home, the amount of grain, the leftovers, that she made it through the day safe, all of those things. And so Naomi tells her, do as Boaz says, stay close to his servants, continue to come under his protection and provision. He is a close relative. He's one of our redeemers. Take advantage of that protection that he gives, because you might not be safe in every field that you go into. Somebody else's young men, or they themselves might take advantage of you, whether that's a verbal assault for being a foreigner or some kind of physical or sexual assault that might be there. That was a real and present danger, as we saw in the book of Judges, what could happen to people that were left on their own in those places and times if you did not have someone to look after you. And so Ruth does as Naomi says and stays close to Naomi, or stays close to the young men. We don't know how old Naomi is, or if she was able to work or not. It may not, as we see Naomi's response to the people as she comes back. I went away full and I came back empty, right? Even though Ruth means fullness. Don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter, for God has made my life bitter. Even if she is physically able, she might not be emotionally able. She might be suffering from severe depression, and which is, and we know can be debilitating for people. And so whatever is not allowing her to go and work, whether it's her age or her physical condition or her mental condition, Naomi, for whatever reason, is not able or doesn't go out to the field to work. And so which puts the burden on Ruth even more if you've been a caretaker for someone that's struggling in any one of those ways. You're not only trying to care for yourself, but you're caring for someone else who's struggling, whether physically or emotionally, and that can be draining and difficult as well. So that's with Ruth and Naomi here. So. And before I get into the Redeemer aspect of this and what a Redeemer was, any questions or comments so far? All right, well, there's a great note in the Lutheran Study Bible that talks about what a Redeemer is, and just, as I looked at other places too, I thought this was the kind of the best summary of that. And that talks about 5 different points of what a redeemer, a kinsman redeemer, was supposed to do. First of all, a kinsman redeemer was supposed to buy back the estate of a deceased relative. And that's talked about in a couple different places in Scripture, and Leviticus 25, and Jeremiah talks about it too. And so the idea there, more than likely, we talked about last week, how Elimelech probably sold his field during the time of this famine in order to provide for he and his family. And, that would have been a last resort, knowing that they would get it back in the year of Jubilee and all of those kinds of things. And probably what made moving to Moab more appealing is because his land wasn't producing, and it maybe wasn't even his land anymore. But that's conjecture. We don't know that for sure, but we do know that it has been sold at some point, because it does need to be redeemed. It does need to be bought back by a near relative. And so a redeemer, if someone, one of their relatives died, the job of the redeemer was to buy that back, so that inheritance, that God-given land that blessing from the Lord would stay within that family. That was the job of the kinsman redeemer, was to redeem the debt, to buy that land back for that dead relative's family. Second, a redeemer was supposed to buy back, redeem, purchase an impoverished relative who had to sell himself into slavery. And that was, again, in Leviticus 25, it talks about that as well. So slavery was not an ethnic or racial thing at this, in Israel's day and age. Slavery was purely an economic arrangement. If you could sell yourself into slavery in order to pay for debts, or to sometimes that had to be imposed upon you. If you had debts you could not pay, you would be sold to make up the loss of the person. It was an economic arrangement. Now you were then the property of, and I know that seems weird in our culture and maybe even immoral or wrong, but you were the property of your master. And now your master had legally the obligation to take care of you and provide for you. And so for many people, being sold into slavery was a step up for them if they were impoverished. Yes, they had to work. They had to work for someone else and were under their purview, but they're also under their protection and provision. And so that was part of the economic arrangement. Slavery, just like the land sales, was not a permanent arrangement. It was more like an indentured servitude, where after a period of time, or after a 7-year period or whatever else, and some of the prohibitions were there, or the regulations were there, that would end. And so it was more like an indentured servitude than it was a slavery kind of a thing. But that's the arrangement that was there. But the kinsman redeemer had the obligation to buy back their relatives from those that were enslaved. That was part of their obligation to do so. They also were able to receive restitution for a crime whose victim was deceased. So say that a relative was killed by someone else, and it was accidental, there still was a restitution that had to be paid. If there wasn't an heir or a closer relative, the redeemer would actually be the one that would receive the restitution, so that everything would be made right that way. The fourth thing then was that they were to do was that if someone had killed your relative, they didn't have, there wasn't the arrangement of courts and jails and all of these kinds of things. If someone killed your relative and it was with malicious intent, if you were the kinsman redeemer, the close relative, you were to be the blood avenger, the one that would seek after them and take their life, a life for a life. And so that was part of the kinsman redeemer's job. Unless there was a ransom, or they could run to these cities of refuge and do those kinds of things. The last thing that a kinsman redeemer was supposed to do was assist a relative in a lawsuit. We see that there was a lawsuit going on, you were supposed to assist them and help them. We see that more anecdotally than we see that in the book of Leviticus or Numbers in the books of the law, but we see this happening anecdotally. And that's really what Boaz does later, is he's assisting Naomi in this, with this legal matter of the property. So that's what a kinsman redeemer, that's what it really meant to be a redeemer, that they would buy back, whether it was land or people. They would receive restitution, and they would also be the ones that would be the avenger of blood, the ones that would seek after and make and take justice and create justice for the family there as well. So any questions on being a redeemer, or anything that you're like, wait, it doesn't say anything about this?
Andy, I do find it odd that, or maybe it's into the weeds, that Ruth went out to go get them something to eat, to go out in the fields, that Naomi didn't say, hey, I have a relative out here, go to his thing. So he knew that because she could have got the land unless she didn't know, or she must have been really depressed over the whole
Yeah.
thing, losing three, her sons and her husband.
Yeah, so we don't really know why Naomi didn't give Ruth more direction. From the beginning here, Ruth is the one that takes the initiative, isn't it? Naomi, I'm going to go out and get food for us. I'm going to go glean in a field. And just hope that somebody takes mercy upon me. And Naomi doesn't give her any direction, whether it's to Boaz or to another near relative. She's kind of leaves Ruth to fend for herself. That is interesting. Yeah, any other thoughts, comments, questions? Hey, go ahead, Mom.
You didn't mention in the kinsman redeemer anything about marriage, did you?
I did not.
But
I did
the
not.
Levirate law called for that. So those were different things. I always thought that was part of it.
Yeah, so they are two different things. The Levirate laws, where you really only applied or had to apply to your husband's brothers. So if it was your husband's brother, then you were to take your brother's wife if he had no male heir, and provide a male heir for your brother. That did not necessarily have to apply beyond the brother relationship. So your brother could be your kinsman redeemer. In that case, they would need to provide all of these things we just talked about in the redeemer part of it, of buying you back or buying your field or being the avenger of blood. And they would then be the one required to provide the Levirate marriage, to provide an heir. But if it went beyond, there was no stipulation law that required that Levirate marriage to happen beyond the brother relationship. And so that was those were two separate things. Sometimes they were very much the same when it was a brother, but if it went beyond the brother, the immediate family, then there was not a requirement for the kinsman redeemer. Dad, you got a thought?
Yeah. Is that possibly why the child later that's born to Ruth and Boaz by genealogy standards is considered Boaz's son and not Ruth's dead husband's son by Levirate law?
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. As I read some of that, it's also that because of Boaz's actions, everybody knows who Boaz is, so he's the one that's highlighted as his father in the midst of that too. So I think there's probably both things going on. Yeah. There's another question. I think Shirley had a question there. Kinsman redeemer is determined. I don't remember how it was determined who the closest relative. This is my guess. All right, so hear me say that, Shirley. This is my guess. Obviously, the brother relationship would be first in the midst of that, and I believe it worked as we, just looking at things like other stories or things we get with Judah and his sons, that it would go from the oldest to the youngest. So if you had two brothers, the oldest of the two remaining would be your kinsman redeemer, your closest kinsman redeemer, and the one that was supposed to fulfill the Levirate law. Now you go outside of that and you get into cousins and things like that. My guess is my guess. I've not read this anywhere or heard anybody talk about this. My guess is the same rule would apply. So if it's so if you don't have no brothers are left, then it's probably like it'd be your dad's oldest brother that's still living, or oldest brother's son that's still living so the oldest cousin in those ways. That would be my guess of how that would work. And so when we get here, Boaz says there's one that's closer. It's probably another cousin, but that cousin might be a little older, or be the son of maybe an older brother or something like that. That's my guess. I don't know any of the other learned people on here have heard anything different with that or have studied that, I'd be open to hearing from you guys or your thoughts on that too. Anybody that's studied there or looked at that more in depth than I have. But that's my guess. Again, redeemers, then they're the ones that buy back the property. They're the ones that make sure the property stays in the family. They're the ones that also make sure that the family is taken care of. And so, although Boaz being a redeemer would not have had to marry Ruth, if he bought the property, he would take care of Ruth and Naomi, but not necessarily have to provide an heir. That would be part of redeeming the property and caring for that way. So that's part of the arrangement, the agreement. They're taking care of the family, even though then they're able to acquire the field as well. So we'll talk about this a little bit more next week too, but just want to add this into the context. The kinsman redeemer then would have, if Ruth is going to sell the rights to her field, or Naomi selling the rights to her field, then what would happen is this kinsman redeemer would have first right of refusal, basically the closest one. They would buy it. It would become part of their field. It would be added to their inheritance. If Elimelech had no living male heir, it would go and become part of that. If there were a Levirate marriage involved, then the son of that marriage, of that Levirate marriage, they would not only get that field. So you're buying a field that you're later going to have to give away to this person, and they're going to get some of your wealth that you've accumulated. And so this Levirate marriage actually decreases the inheritance for the rest of your male heirs, because you're not only having to buy the property that you're going to give away, you also are splitting the rest of your wealth with this other son. And so Levirate marriages were the duty of brothers, but they weren't necessarily financially advantageous for you as the Levirate marrier in the midst of that, which is why we kind of get some of the conflict we see in chapter 4 about, well, I'll redeem it. No, I'm not going to redeem it, in the midst of some of those things with the closest relative. So we'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks. But redeeming it, there were some advantages, but being a Levirate, having a Levirate marriage was not necessarily advantageous. Yeah, Jim?
Yeah, it seems to me that we catch the grace that Boaz has, the freedom he has to act on this. And then we go to the scribes and Pharisees who ask Jesus, if a man dies and how many brothers down the line and whose wife, who's the husband in heaven? Seems like it's a long stretch from Ruth and Boaz all the way down there. And it involves the legalism, not the care that Boaz had.
Right. Yeah, because Boaz doesn't do the letter of the law, does he? No. He goes beyond the letter of the law to get at the heart of it, to really care for Ruth and Naomi throughout the whole story, whether it's dealing with the Levirate marriages or whether it's dealing with how you treat the poor and the sojourner. Boaz looks at the spirit of it and acts, instead of looking at the letter, what his specific legal obligation is in the midst of that. Yeah, good. All right. So out of protection, Ruth has been harvesting with Boaz's servants. Back to the study guide, question 23. The out of protection is really one of safety. She is a unprotected foreign woman in a very patriarchal society. Again, I mentioned it before, but we saw at the end of the book of Judges what can happen to people that are unprotected. Whether that was the Levite or his concubine in the midst of this culture, without a whole lot of recourse that are there. And so Boaz gives her the protection of one of his own servants, that he will defend her and care for her in the midst of this. So, and then how long did she glean in Boaz's field? Did you catch that? Verse 23 says, she kept close to the young woman of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and the wheat harvests. And so just again, to go back to that chart that we looked at earlier. So that this shows that the barley harvests would have begun sometime in March, with the wheat harvest ending sometime in May. And so if you look at that, a couple of months probably are what Ruth is working day after day in the fields of Boaz with his servants to collect this grain. Now there's no combines, and there's no, none of that stuff. It's all manual. And so this food then would be harvested. It would be stored. And then really the matriarch of the family had the job of rationing and managing the household. And that include rationing, managing the food. They managed the household. That was the matriarch of the family's job, to make sure that the grain would last throughout the whole dry season, through the next growing season, till the next harvest, including enough grain to plant for the next harvest, or for the next planting, and then a reserve beyond that if there were a famine or a shortage or anything like that. And so that was the women of this day and age were the ones that managed all of that. That was the matriarch's job, was food. So they would not only get water every day and make bread every day and all of those things, but they were making sure that the grain lasted throughout the whole next year, and caring for the family in that way. So, yeah. All right. So Jim, here, you just kind of, that question that we asked earlier about how do we care for the poor and the vulnerable today? What are some of those protections? And just open that up for discussion. Question 25. What are some of the protections God has put in place to protect the poor and vulnerable today? And we can add to what we talked about earlier, or we can reiterate some of those. Either way. Any thoughts, comments? You can either put them in the chat box or jump in and talk. If you're on a phone, again, to unmute yourself if you're on a phone is *6. If you want to join in the discussion and add your voice to that.
Ruth?
Yeah, go ahead, Ruth.
Okay. I got to get to a commentary, but actually one thing I want to say, most of this is God's instruction to his people how to manage these fairly difficult situations and things that happen to people. But throughout the Bible, they are also given the words that you are to care for the widow and the orphans.
Yep.
And my work with Fraternal, which was AAL and Lutheran Brotherhood, which is now Thrivent, that still carries the words from the Bible, and that's what prompted setting up fraternal insurance for women and children when they lost their husbands. That it threads through all of the different fraternals of the different churches.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
This is still in God's word that we are to take care of them. And I don't know that we really do a very good job at it. That's my observation I've got about 20 years of dealing with Fraternal in my life.
Yeah. Well, interesting. That's a way or perspective that we care for others and do that. And sometimes we don't always do a good job of caring for the widow and the orphan. But again, that is the instruction that God gives to us. He gave to the children of Israel, and maybe the methods have changed, right? We don't do Levirate marriages. We don't have kinsmen redeemers like we do, but the I think the spirit of that still stands, and that carries over into the New Testament, into the early church.
Yeah,
and
it stated
Acts, where they were
clearly in both Old and New Testament. I didn't know the New Testament was there. A couple of Bible studies back, I went, "Oh, it's printed again."
Yeah, just
God repeated it.
That was what the early church was, distributing food to the widows. I mean, that's what they're doing, caring for that. And so some of the comments that other people have made, thanks for that, Ruth. Some of the other comments that people have made, and I guess my mom just went on a roll there. That's good, Mom. Thanks. Just some of those things. Yeah. Our LW Mill puts gift baskets, and Bible studies put gift baskets together for our homebound, for those vulnerable ones. We have people making phone calls to members in our congregation. And they're doing that weekly during this time. And my prayer, my hope is that relationships develop, and that continues after this time. That's something that we'd continue to do. To build family relationships among our members. That's probably the next piece of we're trying to work on in this time of, okay, we've got worship and we can do Bible study, but how do we really build fellowship and support amongst our members? We give money to missions. We provide visits to homebound and shut-ins, and all of that hopefully has increased. I gave that challenge in a sermon a couple weeks ago of making kind of at least one phone call a day to somebody. And I know some of you guys are taking that seriously and doing that to care for each other. It's not only a physical caring; it is that too. But it's also an emotional and emotional caring for people, and a connection that way. Just can see Naomi's need for that in this story, even maybe more than Ruth's, is that emotional connection that's needed. As we think of people, Mom, as you said, just we contact them. And then there's other things today too, and there's different segments. Jim, I think you were alluding to that earlier. There are different segments in our community, and we think of our larger St. Louis community that are more vulnerable and more at need than others. And how do we reach into those communities? Not just while we take care of our own community, how to reach into those communities as well to provide for that. And that's a question, if we're not wrestling with as both individuals and as a church, we need to do that as well. Okay, just to move on for time's sake, I'd love individual conversations with you. If you got specific ideas or things you're doing, I'd love to hear about that too. But question 26, right? How are we to be the answer to prayers for others, right? How does God enable us to be that answer for prayer, right? Boaz blessed Ruth, and then he was the way that she was blessed. Now, as we pray for others, how can God use us that way? And maybe not to discuss that, but just to continue thinking about that. As you pray for something, be ready for God to use you as the answer. To bring his love, his mercy, his grace, his provision, his protection to someone else that way. Okay. And then I just want to spend the last few minutes here talking about how Jesus is our Redeemer. So that is, we talked about Boaz is one of our kinsman redeemers. He's one of our redeemers. And we talked about that word Redeemer meant. Jesus is called the Redeemer. That's one of the titles, one of the names that Jesus is given for us. And so what are the parallels between Jesus and what a Redeemer does in the Old Testament? I'd just love to open that up for discussion for a minute before before closing on that. Yeah, be difference makers, Laura, exactly right. That's what we're called to be. Boaz was that, and we get to be that too. So what are the parallels then between Jesus as our Redeemer and these Old Testament Redeemers? Why is that word chosen, amongst other terms and things as well? But why is that word chosen for Jesus as our Redeemer?
One of the things I think when I think about Jesus as our Redeemer is that he had to buy us back. Once we sinned, we were no longer committed to our Heavenly Father, but the devil had control of our lives. But Jesus, as our Redeemer, was able to purchase us and buy us back. And just like a kinsman redeemer would purchase and buy back the land or keep it in the family, he brought us back to our Heavenly Father.
Yeah, he bought us as individuals back from slavery, but there's also that land aspect of our inheritance has been restored. our relationship with God is restored again. Mom, you said blood avenger. I think that's right too. I think that aspect of it too, of as Jesus is our Redeemer, we think about that of he seeks after and goes after those who seek to destroy us. But the kind of the twist on that is he is destroyed for us. Vengeance is taken upon Jesus so that we could be made whole again. And so that is totally that part of that blood avenger. It's not just Jesus going after and destroying Satan. It really is Jesus. We're the ones that have committed murder and caused destruction. And Jesus, as taking that role of blood avenger, really flips it, and instead of destroying us, destroys himself so that we could have justice. And so he is that redeemer in that sense too, but really flips that on its head. And so there's all of that. There's a blood, as he frees us from the slavery of sin. I actually heard Dr. Reed Lessing, who was a professor at the seminary for a while. He's now a parish pastor in Fort Wayne. He gave a phenomenal sermon on the blood avenger, which you don't think would be a great sermon topic, but it really tied in a lot of those things together of how Jesus is our Redeemer and, gives us the cities of refuge to flee to. He is our city of refuge where we go to when we're guilty, and then he takes care of the cost. He pays the price. As the evil one seeks to come and seek and destroy, he redeems us that way. So thanks be to God for Jesus, who redeems us, who buys us back, who takes us under the shelter of his wings, provides provision and protection for us through his word, through his sacraments, through others, as they care for us, as they are our answer to prayers. So just as Boaz was the answer to his own blessing, just as Ruth and Naomi were probably praying for protection, provision, Boaz was the answer to that prayer. And so God uses us that way to provide protection, provision for others, to be the answer to their prayers as well. And so as the Lord takes us under his wings, we find shelter there and peace. What a great message from Ruth that we learn about, again, who Jesus is for us, but as his people, then what he calls us to do, what it looks like to live faithfully, working diligently and hard and caring for those around us, even as Ruth cared for Naomi, as Boaz cared for Ruth, and through Ruth, through Naomi, in the midst of those things. So the challenge today is to continue to be the hands and feet of Jesus. As those that have been redeemed, have been brought back from slavery to sin, we share that love, that mercy, that grace.
Anything in particular? Okay.
So, all right, let's go ahead and close with prayer, and let's go ahead and close with prayer, and we'll let you go for today. Hang on a little bit if anybody has anything else they want to follow up with. Heavenly Father, thanks so much for today. Thanks for the example of Ruth and Boaz, of your word that you give to us. Thank you most of all, Lord, for Jesus, for answering our prayers through him, to provide for us, to protect us, to provide for us, to give us shelter under your wings. Lord, we ask that this day, as we go out from here for whatever our tasks that lie before us, that you would provide that provision and protection for us. Remind us again how we have been bought back from slavery. And then as those who have been redeemed, Lord, help us to be that answer of prayer to someone else, to provide and protect them in turn because of what you have done for us. Lord, it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, thank you all. Good to see you again this week. Bible class on Sunday morning, if you're able to join us there as well at 9 o'clock. And